So when we think about our children at the borders, I mean, obviously these kids are going through a lot of hardship, especially these kids that have been separated.
Oh, absolutely. And just think of how hard it was to get there, right? And not just like physically getting there, but the circumstances that they were before they decided that they needed to leave. And that's where I got most frustrated, is that historically when families or people are in dangerous situations and gangs and threats and domestic violence and rape, as a human being, it's fight or flight, right?
Yeah.
And if you can get out of the situation, that's what you do. And to be denied at our border is just heartbreaking. And then at the same time, take your kids away.
Separate from your families. Well, that's why we wanted to bring in Dr. Jodi Berger Cardoso. She's an associate professor at the University of Houston in the Graduate College of Social Work. So many people have recommended Jodi to us. Jodi, how are you doing today?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Cardoso, when we look at what's happening on our borders, and we had a couple of press conferences at Children at Risk last week in Dallas and in Houston, and one of the things we're trying to bring attention to is sort of the plight of these kids and what they're going through. So, when you think about their psyche and the trauma that they're experiencing, what's it doing to these kids, Jodi?
So they bring with them a whole host of trauma exposures in their lifetime. My research with unaccompanied minors, for example, shows that on average, youth experience 8 traumatic events in their life, and these youth are only 14.
Wow.
And this is mostly even before they get to the United States. And then there's a whole host of challenges with integration and going to school and poverty that they experience here. So these youth and families are arriving at the border already with very significant trauma exposure. And then they're going through a very stressful experience. They don't speak the language, they don't understand the culture or the context. But what they do believe is they have the right to seek asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border. And many of these families are doing just that. They're arriving and they're seeking asylum, and they're met with that procedural process by separation because they crossed illegally into the United States. And that exacerbates their previous trauma exposure and puts them at risk and increases their vulnerability to mental health problems like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, separation anxiety, and all of the other kinds of problems that we hear with kids who have chronic trauma exposure and during early childhood.
Dr. Berger Cardoso, do you think that the authorities at the border really understand what these kids are going through? I mean, are they oblivious to all of this and they're just sort of following orders? Or do you think there's an understanding of what these kids and their families have gone through and what state they're in?
I can't say with certainty because I haven't conducted any research interviewing border control or security people at the border. But if I had to guess based on what I know just about human beings, is that many of them probably feel very ambivalent about what's going on. They feel very torn. They have a job to do. The job requires them to implement policies, and those policies are not child and family focused, and they have very significant impacts on these families. And I'm sure that many, many people at the border feel quite ambivalent about what they're being instructed to do.
No, absolutely. I can't imagine. No. And it's your job and you're told to do this. But if you are a parent or have any loved ones, it would be so hard to witness that.
Right?
Yeah, you would think. Yeah, you can't speak
right,
for
and
everyone.
in these border communities, they're used to the border, right? It used to be that people came and went. They came across the border and went across the border very freely. And so many of these people have ties across the border. They speak Spanish, or they grow up in very transitional areas where their neighbors are from Mexico or from Central America. And so I would guess that they have a lot of ambivalence about what they're being asked to do, especially given the consequences of those actions.
So what kind of services and therapy do children need to help them get back on the right path? So I'm not saying necessarily these children, but maybe we are, but the studies that you have done around unaccompanied children, I mean, can they make it? Can they get back? Clearly they have several obstacles in front of them.
They do, but what we know is that while they have really significant challenges, they have pretty miraculous resilience. I mean, if you can imagine traveling over 1,500 miles by yourself, right, to get and reunify with family with whom you haven't seen in a long time, and to do that all under the context of going to school every day, that demonstrates pretty significant resilience. Mm-hmm. Many people would shut down and would be unable to keep going there. And these kids really rise to the occasion. So while they have really experienced quite extensive trauma, they've also been able to really rise above and do some of the things that we see typical adolescent kids do. Now, I think that we could do better, right? We could give them the same benefits that we give citizen kids when we give citizen kids access to care. Unfortunately, in Texas, we know that mental health treatment is really not very accessible for U.S. citizen kids, much less immigrant kids, right? Generally, Texas is ranked like 49th in the nation for mental health services.
Right.
So we have really a long way to raise the bar for everyone, right? But there are very good modalities that have been successful in reducing trauma symptoms in youth. Some of those modalities are trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, we've used with kids exposed to long-term trauma. We've also seen some success with cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, which is a group-based intervention that is rooted in TFCBT, but executed in a group like in a group format. And the point is that kids normalize these experiences for themselves in these group settings, and these models have shown to reduce post-traumatic stress symptoms, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. And so we do have a lot of knowledge about what works for kids exposed to long-term trauma. The question is, will we give kids access?
Jodi, let me ask you one last question. We have talked extensively at Children at Risk and in our press conferences about the trauma of family separation. And so now that ostensibly our federal government is saying we're going to keep the kids with their parents, but we're going to incarcerate them, right? They're going to be detained. Is that indeed, I mean, if I'm a child, if I'm a 10-year-old child and separated from my mom, I know that's horrible. But now that I'm going to be detained with my mom and my dad, how much better is that for that child?
Research is really clear that family separation is not in the best interest of the child. We see that very strongly highlighted in the UN Convention of the Child. We also see very clearly articulated in the UN Convention that children should not, under any circumstances, be detained in detention centers for long periods of time, for any period of time.
Yeah.
But for undetermined periods of time, we know that detention on children increases their likelihood of post-traumatic stress disorder. It increases depression and anxiety in children. It also increases that in their parents, and parents who are more depressed and more anxious are less available emotionally and physically to their children, and that also impacts child mental health. There is no circumstance for which the research suggests that detention within the family system is better for kids than family separation. That is just another way to re-traumatize children and to take away the media focus on the separation piece. But really, detaining children, even in the context of the family unit, is still a violation of their human rights, and it goes against all research suggesting that such detention should be such detention has negative consequences, both short-term and long-term, for their mental health.
Well, it's obvious to us, right, that the best having to do the best for our children, for our families, for these children, for these families, is not the intent of our administration.
Not the zero tolerance
this is
policy.
not a good thing. So, Jodi, we thank you so much for your expertise in this area, and I hope that we can call on you again as this crisis continues, because it's not over, right? I think it's not over, and there's still a lot of work to be done. Jodi Berger Cardoso is Associate Professor at the University of Houston at the Graduate College of Social Work. Thank you, Jodi, very much for being on the program. Thank you for what you do.
Okay, take care, you guys. Thank you so much.
All right,
bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
You're listening to
Go
Growing
Cougs.
Up in America. Yeah, that's where you went to the Graduate College of Social Work,
I
didn't
did.
you? Yeah. So, are they Cougars? Is that the graduate school? I guess the whole
University of
school.
Houston.
Yeah. And you go to all the football games and basketball games,
Every
don't you,
single
Amanda?
one.
Because you're just
No,
like a big
I
old
don't.
big old fan.
I do
right?
go. I go to them.
You have been?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I went to one once.
Great.